There's a lie going round about some triune God, some kind of three-headed monster that just can't be described.
Hello there, YouTube. Ethan Smith here. Was the early church oneness by majority, or Sabellian or modalistic, and denied the Trinity, as oneness Pentecostals today often like to claim? Let's look at the evidence. First off, according to the extensive studies done by Dr. Steve Morrison, Director of Research for Christian Answers, 15 early Christian writers before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD precisely mentioned the term Trinity with favor. This includes Theophilus of Antioch, the first person recorded to do so, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Origen, and Novatian, all the way to Alexander of Alexandria. According to my estimation, we have about 50 to 60 different Greek and Latin early church writers, or fathers, who wrote before 325 AD. A large chunk of them, 15, affirmed the word Trinity, and yet none denied it or rejected it.
We do not have any writings that oppose the views of these men because they were destroyed. What Ethan Smith fails to mention is that all these men were also Greek philosophers. The early church fathers took their Logos Christology from Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria was a first-century Jewish Greek philosopher who allegorized the scriptures. He also dabbled in the occult.
We now want to turn to a historical survey of how great Christian thinkers have sought to formulate this doctrine into a systematic package. And we're going to begin with the early Greek apologists of the 2nd century. These were men like Justin Martyr, Tatian, Theophilus, Athenagoras, and so on. Now, you might not have ever heard of these men, but these were some of the earliest Christian authors writing in defense of the Christian faith during the 2nd century. And since they wrote in Greek, they're known collectively as the Greek Apologists. These thinkers sought to connect the divine word of the prologue of John's Gospel, the Logos, whom John says was in the beginning with God, and who was God, with the Logos as it plays a role in the thought of the Jewish Hellenistic philosopher Philo of Alexandria. Now, when we say that Philo was a Hellenistic Jew, what one means is that he was heavily influenced in his thought by Greek thought. Hellenistic comes from the Greek word Elene, which means Greek.
There never has been any considerable body of men, either in ancient or in modern times, who profess what are called Sabellian principles. And at present, however, it is enough to remark that very few professing Christians, if any, have deliberately and intentionally advocated Sabellian principles, and that there is no pretense for alleging that the doctrine of the early church was Sabellian. Now, why would a scholar of this caliber claim this so confidently?
There were lots of people who bought this view at the end of the 2nd century. This was a popular view. We learn from the opponents of this view that in fact, the bishops of Rome held this view. The Bishop of Rome is the Pope. So what we would today call the Pope. There were popes who held this view, and the opponents of this view admitted that most people in Christianity held this view. Just giving you the basic view.
A theological school was established at Rome to combat the false teaching coming from the school of Alexandria, which was the Trinity. The school of Rome was headed by the Bishop of Rome. Sabellius was a student of that school.
is no pretense for alleging that the doctrine of the early church was Sabellian. Now, why would a scholar of this caliber claim this so confidently? Let's look at the evidence. For example, according to Dr. Steve Morrison again, 24 early Christian writers taught that the Son of God pre-existed his incarnation, and 0 early Christians denied it. It was a universally accepted doctrine. This goes in sharp contradiction to oneness Pentecostal theology that denies the pre-existence of the Son as the Son, and believe the Son was begotten and created from the womb of Mary. So Dr. Steve Morrison would say the pre-existence of the Son of God before his birth was unanimous in the early church, and William Cunningham would agree. He also wrote, and then, on the other hand, we have the whole body of the ancient fathers declaring unanimously, as a point quite certain in itself and universally acknowledged, the pre-existence of Christ, his existence before he...
The teaching of a pre-existing Christ was the main battle between those who taught the Trinity and the majority that rejected such a pagan idea. The Logos Christology of Philo was being taught as Christ existing with the Father. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. John 1:1.
It's interesting that scholar John Henry Newman wrote, quote, "This school, Sabellianism, of which Notus was the most noted master, is supposed to be an offshoot of the Gnostics, and doubtless it is historically connected with branches of that numerous family. Irenaeus is said to have written against it, which either proves its antiquity or seems to imply its origination in those previous Gnostic systems, against which his extant work is entirely directed. It may be added that Simon Magus, the founder of the Gnostics, certainly held a doctrine resembling that advocated by the Sabellians. Gnosticism was a serious threat to the church early on, and existed before Sabellianism came about. But to be fair to our oneness friends, there is no evidence that Sabellius or his followers believed in the demiurge of Gnosticism, or that all material, physical, fleshly things are evil, or that the God of the Old Testament was malicious and a different God from...
Ethan Smith has it backwards. It was the Gnostics who took Philo's teaching of the Logos wisdom and made it into God the Father, God the Son, which was the Logos, and the Mother, which was Sophia, or wisdom. Proof. Tertullian was accused of following the teachings of Valentinus, considered to be the greatest Gnostic of all times. Volume 3, Ante-Nicene Fathers, page 602.
Irenaeus of Lyons catalogued all of the heresies of his time, and he never heard of anyone with this view either. But Hippolytus, pupil of Irenaeus, is the first to mention the heretic Sabellius by name in his catalogue, Refutation of All Heresies. Hippolytus also wrote against Callistus and Notus, but the first to mention of the view of Sabellius, though not by name, is Tertullian, 213 A.D.
Irenaeus was a follower of Philo, along with Theophilus, who was the first to coin the word Trinity. Irenaeus taught Philo's God, Word, and Wisdom in Volume 1. Hippolytus was the first anti-pope in history. He left the Catholic Church to start his own. Reason: he was not in agreement with the Roman popes who rejected the Trinity. What I would tell Ethan Smith is to start all over again and go back to the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers and to study them very carefully, because he massacred the true teaching of the history of the Trinity.